a week now since President Trump endorsed Ken Paxton for this Senate seat. Does that mean that the result today is all but guaranteed to go for him? What does the polling bear out at this point?
Well, I think it's close to all but guaranteed. I mean, I think throughout this race, we've been, sort of adding the caveat to the fact to this race that John Cornyn, has not been the most popular Republican for a long time, yet, as you pointed out, has served in office in one guise or another for decades, literally, and has had that Senate seat for decades. But Ken Paxton, I think, to really just look at the polling and to look at the dynamics in the party in Texas, Ken Paxton is much more where the Republican primary electorate is at right now, for lack of a more technical term. John Cornyn is, I think, widely viewed as kind of something like yesterday's Republican, and this is really, even though the campaigns try to make it about ideology, it's much about style and alignment with President Trump as it is about anything.
What do you make of the way that Republicans are framing James Talarico? Dr. Ken Paxton's not waiting around for the results of this runoff. They're treating this like it's a general election already. And some of the names that were flying in Katy, Texas the other evening, as he passed the microphone around to ask people to suggest nicknames. Tofu Talarico came up. Talafrico came up. You listen to what President Trump said about him on Air Force One just a couple of weeks ago. I guess it was last week, as a matter of fact. A weird candidate, 6 genders, a real hit on Jesus. He's a vegan, the president said. He pronounces it vegan. Is this stuff resonating in Texas?
Well, I think this was pretty predictable. I think one of the things that was kind of lost in the Democratic primary when James Talarico beat Jasmine Crockett was that, he did have a very prominent public record, taking a lot of very progressive positions. And I think it was bound to come back in the general election setting. So, look, I think this is about making sure that, there's no Republican defections, which I think is not much of a problem, but also to speak to more conservative-leaning independents as Republican operatives and the Paxton campaign and its allies anticipate winning and anticipate a very Democratic year in Texas, playing on Talarico's positions in the way that you're talking about and using this kind of Trump style, which I was sort of alluding to a minute ago, are really all about making sure Republicans don't stay home and that there's, not leakage among non-Republican voters when we get around to the general election.
Well, and when we consider those general election dynamics, and again, it's not a sure thing that John Cornyn is going to lose this evening, but if he does, are Cornyn voters more likely to switch their votes to Ken Paxton, vote for James Talarico, or just not participate?
Well, we don't know that. I mean, I think that's one of obviously the big questions. In some polling that we did in April at UT Austin, one of the things we found, though, was that not by a huge margin, but by a slight margin, Cornyn voters actually were more likely by a little bit to vote for Paxton than Paxton voters were to vote for Cornyn in general election matchups against Talarico. So I think one of the things that's been, I think, a little bit misestimated here going into the general election is the degree to which Cornyn was obviously a better candidate for Republicans. Cornyn is marginally more well-liked among some Democrats and independents, but it's really not a big difference. And actually, you probably have a bigger problem with Republican turnout if Cornyn is the candidate than if Paxton is the candidate. Because, as I've said, Paxton is just much more in touch with where the Republican electorate is right now. That shows up in virtually all of the numbers, and that's the big dilemma for Republicans thinking about the general election. Should Paxton win the election, is how do you weigh the need to make sure that Republicans don't lose morale in a very pro-democratic environment, even in Texas, in this election cycle, versus what you might lose with persuadable voters. And I think it's just too, honestly, it's just too soon to tell. We're going to need to see what happens this summer with the economy, where Trump is, and what things are looking like after Labor Day.
Well, with that said, you were in the field in April, but the Texas Politics Project poll finds in each matchup, Tallarico leads by 7 points against Cornyn, 40% to 33%, and by an indistinguishable 8 points against Paxton, 42 to 34. How should we read this then? This is Tallarico's race to lose.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would not read it that way, honestly. I think what you have to do is look at look at those numbers, is notice that if you look at by party breakdown in both of those matchups, Tallarico versus Cornyn, Tallarico versus Paxton, Tallarico gets virtually all of the Democrats, 80%, which is all given the tension level in April. Neither Paxton nor Cornyn were able to attract more than about 60%. I think one had 60 and Cornyn had 60 and Paxton had 61, so statistically indistinguishable. About 60% of Republicans. So I think you have to read that lead for Tallarico through the lens of the fact that that poll was conducted in the midst of this really personal, deeply negative primary runoff. And so those numbers are going to move a lot between now and the fall.
Understood.
Just quickly, Doctor, $130 million spent in this primary and runoff. Is it the money ultimately that you think will make a difference one way or the other, or just the endorsement or lack thereof of the president?
Well, I think if it was going to be the money, Cornyn would be running away with it. So it's pretty clearly not that. I think, as your reporter said to some degree, Trump's endorsement was in a way pro-cyclical. I think that there was a real sense that Paxton was in the lead. But the Trump endorsement really sealed that, which is why the Cornyn folks tried so hard to prevent that from happening, as it turned out, unsuccessfully.